All right, hi everyone. These videos are a review of what we went over in class, so you can either watch this if you didn't understand something, or if you were absent, you please watch these videos so you can see what we went over that day. I will be going quickly over the information, so you can pause whenever you need to copy down your notes. But starting with Washington's presidency, this is the do now for the day if you were absent. So it's just watching the video and answering the two questions at the top of your notes. So what we're looking at is starting Unit 5 with the early republic. So last unit we talked about ratifying the Constitution and how our government was set up. And now we're going to be basically starting with year 1 with Washington's presidency to be looking at how things went. Did things go smoothly? What challenges Washington had to face and all that. So our learning intention is that we want to explain ways in which the federal government developed under George Washington's leadership. And our success criteria, by the end of this, you should be able to summarize how Washington's actions contributed to the development of the American political system. Now, when we're learning all of this, the question I want you to be thinking about is what challenges face the new nation under the Constitution. So by the end of this PowerPoint, you should be able to explain, summarize, and answer the question without a problem. Now, if you have an issue, that's when you come to tutorials so we can make sure that you get all this information. So first, looking at Washington's presidencies, there are a few major challenges that he faced. The first one, and I'm going to go in detail with each one, so I'm just going to quickly read over these. So the first one is how to define the authority of the central government. The second challenge was to create a stable economic system. They also needed to build a military, maintain national security, conduct foreign relations, and enter into treaties with several Indian tribes. So the first thing I want to go over is a review about domestic versus foreign policy, because what we're going to do is split Washington's presidency into two parts. One, domestic policy, and then the second one, foreign policy. So today we're going to be focusing on his domestic policy, and domestic policy refers to government policies dealing with conditions within the nation. So we're going to be looking at all the issues we had going on in our nation at this time. So what challenges did we have that only dealt with the United States? Now, the next PowerPoint will be going over foreign policy, and foreign policy is or our concerns relations with other countries. So whenever we start dealing with other countries, that's where we'll get foreign policy. Now, this picture over here is a current example from last President Obama. One of his big domestic policies was health reform, and eventually Obamacare got passed. But one of his big domestic policies was healthcare, and healthcare would deal within the United States and not dealing with foreign countries. So it's just an example. So the very first domestic challenge that Washington faced was to define our new central government, because remember when we were going over the Articles of Confederation and then ratifying the Constitution, the big debate was how much power do we give the central and federal government. So we want to give it enough power to do its job, but we don't want to give it too much power because we don't want our government turning into a tyranny like King George or other monarchs at the time. So the Constitution, it allowed the president to appoint officials in charge of executive departments. Now, this established the very first cabinet. In a cabinet are chief officials that Washington appointed that met together with him. Now, this established a precedent for later presidents. Now, a precedent is an action taken for the first time, which is followed by others afterwards. So this is one of the first precedents that Washington sets up that other presidents are then going to follow. There are, I think, like 3 to 4 precedents that you need to know by the end of this, and so this is going to be one of them. Now, the importance of this is it established presidential power over the whole executive branch, because he is able to dismiss or fire any of his cabinet members as he chooses. The first time we will see a cabinet member dismissed will be with John Adams' presidency, but that will be on another PowerPoint slide. So Washington's first cabinet, we obviously have President Washington. Then we have the Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. This is who we're all pretty much familiar with now because of the musical. So this is his position, his right-hand man next to Washington. He influenced Washington a lot. So Treasury, that makes you think of treasure, which is money. So it's basically the secretary overlooking the economy. Then we have Secretary of State, so state relations is Thomas Jefferson. And then the Attorney General is Edmund Randolph. So that is going to be his very first cabinet. Now, you do not have to have every single person memorized. You just need to know what was their role during this time period. Now, the big issue with Washington, one of the very first challenges that he faced, is that they had a lot of debt from the American Revolution, and so they had to come up with a plan to fix it. So each state at the time had different amounts of debt, but every state had debt at this point. So they needed to pay off the debt. Now, Alexander Hamilton, our nation's first Secretary of Treasury, he created a 4-part plan for getting the nation on a sound financial basis. So these are the 4 parts to his plan. You do need to know all 4 of these parts. So the very first part was to repay the debt. He believed the national government should pay off debt to establish the nation's credit. He thought that it would make it easier to borrow money in the future, give the nation credibility, be able to kind of just move forward as a nation. Then we have a national bank. This is a place to deposit taxes, provide currency, and to make loans. This was a very big controversy because at the time, there's going to be people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, who are going to argue that the Constitution doesn't give us the authority to establish a national bank, so that's going to provide an issue. And Hamilton also proposed a whiskey tax to raise money from Western farmers. So the farmers would use excess grain to make whiskey to then, it was portable, or it was easier to transfer. So they made whiskey from their excess, the extra amounts of grain that they had, to make money. And so Hamilton wanted to make revenue from that, so he proposed a whiskey tax. Now, if you think about the American Revolution, every time there's been a big tax on something, it hasn't really worked out well. So we'll see how that works down the line. And then the last part is a protective tariff. So a tariff is a tax. And basically the protective tariff wanted Congress to pass a protective tariff to protect American industries from foreign competition. And a protective tariff is a tax on imported foreign goods. So essentially what a protective tariff is if Americans are making, let's say, something like socks or a t-shirt or whatever. So let's go with socks. And the sock costs $1.50 to make, and you'll then sell it in the United States for $1.50. Well, Britain is also selling socks, and so they bring socks over here and they sell it for $1. So at that point, if you had to pick between the two, you would obviously be buying the cheaper Britain socks. So what Hamilton wanted to do was to propose a tax so that Britain would have to pay a tax if they were going to sell it here. So instead of the sock being $1, now it's going to be $2 because they have to pay $1 tax. So if you're having to choose between a $1.50 sock from the United States or a $2 sock from Britain, most likely you are going to choose the $1.50 sock that's made in the United States. Now what that's going to do, that's going to help American industries, so those that are producing socks here, because people are going to buy more socks, but that is going to hurt our trade with Britain because they're not going to make as much money, and the trade is going to go down there. So now Hamilton's plan is going to make a huge response. All right, so Southern leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison strongly opposed the plan. They did not like the plan. There was a lot of issues that they did not like. The first is that they thought it was unfair for the South to have to pay for the debt of the northern states. Now Hamilton would argue, well, you didn't have as much debt because you make money from not paying labor and you have slavery, and so he thought that was an issue. But the Southern leaders, Jefferson and Madison, they also thought the Constitution didn't give Congress the authority to create a national bank. And this disagreement gave rise to America's first political parties. This is something you do need to know for your test. The political parties, which will be a whole nother PowerPoint that we'll be going over, but this is a big start to it. So political parties are associations that try to elect their members to government offices so that they will pass laws favorable to their ideas. Now, at this time period, they come up with a compromise. So those that opposed Hamilton's plan, they worked with Hamilton to create a compromise. Now, if you're familiar with Hamilton the musical, this would be the song, The Room Where It Happens. Okay, so they come up with a compromise. And the compromise is that the Southern leaders would vote for his plan to pay off state debt if he would support locating the nation's capital in the South. So at the point in time, our capital is in New York City. So they wanted to move the capital from New York to Virginia in the South. And Hamilton agreed because he wanted his plan voted through. So that is the compromise. All part of Hamilton's program was approved except for the proposed tariff. Southern states thought it would be harder to sell their crops to Britain and to buy British goods, so they did not vote that forward. Now, establishing the court system. Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established a federal court system. Now, this act marked the first step in creating a strong and independent national judicial system. Now, that sounds very complicated. Essentially, what happened was the Constitution created the judicial branch and it created the Supreme Court. But what it did not include were the details. It did not give us a procedure, didn't give us the steps and how to get to the Supreme Court. It didn't give the details on who should serve on the Supreme Court. So it was still kind of iffy. So the Judiciary Act kind of set it up and said, we're going to have lower courts, we'll have district court first, then we'll have the Court of Appeals. We're going to establish how many members can be on the Supreme Court, and then we're going to have a Chief Justice, within which President Washington chose John Jay to lead as the Chief Justice. Now, the worksheet that we looked at, which was the Before and After Judiciary Act, that is going to go in a lot more depth about what that specifically looked like. So please reference that worksheet if you have further questions. Now, the Bill of Rights, we've already learned this last semester. This is just a refresher. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The reason we came up with the Bill of Rights is because we were afraid to give the government too much power. So we wanted to limit the powers of government to protect individual liberty. Now, the Declaration of Independence listed grievances, which are basically complaints against King George. It just listed them off. So the Bill of Rights was created to limit the power of government by protecting individual liberty. Now, this is going to be a reaction to the whiskey tax that was passed by Hamilton. So we had the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. So farmers living west of the Appalachian Mountains converted their extra grain into whiskey. Now, this new federal whiskey tax caused hostility among them. So farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay the tax and they threatened tax collectors. So Washington called the militia to put down the rebellion. The government was ready to use force, but the rebels fled before any fights took place. So essentially nothing really happened with the Whiskey Rebellion, but the important thing is kind of comparing it to Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion was from last semester. So with this quick write, I just want you to compare how were Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion handled differently. Because Shays' Rebellion, remember, it happened and the government really wasn't able to stop it or put it down. So that's kind of what convinced Washington to go to the Constitutional Convention to give the government more power. Now, with the Whiskey Rebellion, we essentially have the government being able to step up and be able to use force, and because of that, the rebels stepped down. So it's essentially showing how our government has changed, and now it has the power to do its job. So that would be the quick write. And very quickly, I want to go over these two questions. So Alexander Hamilton's economic plan was designed to what? Either help build the national economy, encourage British imports, prevent congressional control of interstate commerce, or strengthen the powers of states' government. The correct answer is A. It wanted to help build the national economy. Now, let's go through the other answer choices so you can see why the other ones are incorrect. So, encourage British imports. It was the opposite of that because he established the protective tariff. He wanted to encourage American manufacturing. And letter C, prevent congressional control of interstate commerce. We didn't really talk anything about interstate commerce. That wasn't something that was discussed. But I can see why you would pick that one just because it sounds like it would be correct. And then D is strengthen the powers of state governments. His plan wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to strengthen the federal government. So it would be the opposite of that. Now, the people who wanted to strengthen the state government would be Jefferson and Madison. So that's just a review of this PowerPoint. At any point, if you have questions, please come to tutorials.